Hey guys, hi, welcome back once again. My name is Vaishali, and having learned quite a few things from, through, and from within human interactions, and having pursued and completed my master's in business administration and in clinical psychology, and having had the chance to work as a counselor and as a therapist over the last few years, I today wish to talk about vicariously living through others. Or let's even just call it vicarious living. So it's a felt sense of experience or a watched sense of experience, in a way, quite literally, an embodied experience. And many a times, vicariously living that way is not problematic, but it does turn problematic. It does become a nuisance when many a times it takes us into flights of fantasy for a brief period of time, but then to add to it, we are not able to practice that very thing that we essentially want to embody on a very personal level through our own doing, by our own doing, which is when it begins to affect our self esteem, our self confidence, our self worth, wherein we begin to realize that many a times we are wishing to avoid certain things, we are wishing to find an escape into another part of us that wishes to embody something through vicarious living without us actually having to do the same, without us actually having to put it into practice. It is in these moments that we find that kind of vicarious living being detrimental to our own growth. And then it becomes a bigger problem when we are vicariously trying to live our lives, trying to live our aspirations through somebody else, which in a way then makes me reflect on Carl Jung's quote, which went something like this: the greatest burden for a child is the unlived life of its parents. And so, if I can cite a few examples over here to help us understand what vicarious living looks like, feels like, is embodied like, we'll probably get a chance to understand, we'll probably get a chance to reflect if you're vicariously living through somebody else. And maybe then even begin to question as to why exactly are we doing it if you're at all trying to do it, knowingly or unknowingly, consciously or unconsciously. So, the first example that comes into my head is in keeping with our own mythology, the greatest epic of all times, the Mahabharata, wherein this blind king Dhritarashtra was trying to live his life through his eldest son, Duryodhan. For because of his blindness, so many thousands of centuries back, he missed out on certain opportunities, he was denied certain opportunities, because of which, quite naturally, his self worth and his self esteem, his confidence in himself, took a hard beating. And not being able to cope with that to a very large degree, he was trying to make his son do a lot of things that he was denied the opportunities for, that he did not get an opportunity to do. invariably putting a lot of undue stress on this eldest son. The other example that comes into my mind is of the recently released movie Michael, based on the life of Michael Jackson. So here was this father who was physically and verbally and emotionally quite abusive towards his sons, maybe towards his entire family as well. He, of course, was a very ambitious man. He, of course, was a very driven man. He was a very passionate man. But since he wanted to live a big life, since he wanted to be the biggest and the best in the world, which he could not do for himself, he tried to enforce it onto his sons. And since Michael, probably being the most talented amongst his siblings, as a singer and as a dancer, became the extra privileged one to get his father's extra dose of medicines. Whether it came as being extra hard on Michael, making him work extra hard compared to others, almost making him work like a slave, wherein he had control over Michael's time and Michael's life for most of Michael's life, to making deals for Michael without even his consent, to giving some extra dose of medicine with regards to verbal abuse, with regards to being hit by belt and other things. It was all done in the name of love. It was all done in the name of channeling, of channelizing Michael's musical and dance talent, at the cost of leaving this little kid friendless for almost all of his life. And because to a large degree, Michael got extra dosage of everything that probably his other siblings did not receive to that extent, he as a child, or even as a grown-up man, felt extra burdened, felt overloaded with expectations that were too big for his small frame, that were too big for his small shoulders to carry on, to live with, to handle. And thereby, for all of us, those who watched the movie, will also notice that Michael was trying to earn his father's love by trying to be perfect, whatever perfect meant in Michael's father's eyes. Wherein it became his own internal dialogue, his own internal thought that he needed to be perfect, if he needed to feel loved at all, that he needed to be perfect, for nothing less than perfect would work for him, would work for his father, and would work for their relationship. That nothing less than perfect was good enough, was worthwhile, was worthy of appreciation and acceptance. And on the other hand, it was also Michael's way of trying to avoid getting abused, getting beaten up by his father. Because if he was perfect, he would avoid the punishments, he would avoid the beatings, he would avoid the abuse, and probably also get some kind of acknowledgement. But even if he did not get that, at least when he's been able to avoid the punishments, he would still feel loved by just being perfect, by just delivering perfect. And in a way that should make us question, in a very curious and compassionate way, that what was Michael's father trying to avoid facing himself when he was wanting everything to be perfect? What was the pain that Michael's father was trying to avoid, was trying to escape, when he was enforcing it on Michael and on himself? The idea of being perfect, the idea of doing things to perfection. And maybe that might give us some kind of an insight into our own selves when we are wanting to be perfect, when we are wanting to do things perfectly. Because still it becomes flawless. It's really not acceptable. It's really not worthwhile for us if we also are striving for perfection. Likewise, if we take the example of Andre Agassi, Through his book Open, we'll also understand that his father, who was an Italian immigrant and had migrated, had shifted to the US of A, was trying to live his aspirations, was trying to live a big life for himself through one of his gifted child, Andre Agassi, who also from a very young age, just like Michael Jackson, was pressurized into doing things perfectly. Into giving in perfect shots, into having the perfect image, which can very well be seen, which can very well be felt through his book, Open, an autobiography. Likewise, if we take the example of the movie Three Idiots, we'll notice that whether it's Viru Sahasrabuddhe or whether it's original Ranchhod Das Chachar's father, in a way Javed Jafri's father in the movie, or whether it's Farhan Qureshi's dad, i.e. R. Madhavan's dad in the movie, are all the characters that are vicariously trying to live their lives, trying to live their dreams, trying to live their aspirations, their unfulfilled, their unlived life through their kids, through their sons. Wherein Viru Sahasrabuddhe wanted his son to be an engineer, for he was the director of a very well-known engineering college, which is why he wanted his son to become an engineer. It would have been validation for his college, for his success, for his way of administration. It would have been validation to get his own son into his own engineering college, of which he was a director, for his legacy, for his work to be carried on, to be carried forward. It would have been an applause in the academic world, in the world of engineering. It would have been validation in terms of social appraisal. In keeping with the world of academics and engineering, it essentially would have been a badge of honor, a social badge of honor for his own work, wherein his work, to a very large degree, quite unconsciously, defined his entire existence. The thing to be noticed here is that it was not who he defined his work to be, but rather it was his work that defined him, that defined his social status, his social standing, his social metrics in his own head and in his own heart. And of course, it comes with societal conditioning as well, that boys need to be engineers and girls need to be doctors or something else. Where Farhan Qureshi's dad, right from his childhood, had sacrificed a lot of things that he wanted for himself so that his son could then become an engineer, so that he could essentially feel proud of himself that his son is finally an engineer and probably working in a big corporate company, which would have elevated his social status by another notch, which would have elevated his social image by another notch, to another degree. And the original Ranchhod Das Chachar's father, who essentially was an illiterate man, a very wealthy man, financially wealthy man, but an illiterate man, who could not face people mocking him, whose self-worth, whose self-esteem, whose self-confidence, and whose self-trust took a hard beating when people mocked him, when people laughed at him behind his back. Which is why, in order to quieten all of those people, he needed his son to be literate. And maybe just not literate, but even procure an engineering degree from one of the country's most renowned engineering colleges, so that he could put it on his wall as a sense of pride, as a badge of honor, as a sense of personal accomplishment, personal achievement that he could display, that he could portray in order to avoid, in order to mitigate, in order to bypass the kind of internal shame that he felt within himself, the kind of internal shame that he not just felt, but also experienced and lived with for almost all of his life. That even if he was illiterate, at least his son was now an engineer, is now an engineer, was probably now more literate compared to many of those people of that area put together, which would elevate his social status, which would make others not laugh at his back, which would make him more respectable in the society. Now, if you look at the movie Dil Dhadakne Do, we'll also notice that Shefali Shah in the movie as Ranveer Kapoor's mother, as Kabir's mother, is trying to live vicariously through him. For she felt stifled in her marriage. For she felt underappreciated in her marriage. For she felt unheard in her marriage. For she felt unnoticed and unseen in her marriage. She was trying to meet all of her son's aspirations, which thankfully were his, by trying to stand up against her own husband, and in a way very subtly conveying to us that I'll still have my voice in this marriage, that I'll still have my opinions in this household through fulfilling my son's aspirations, so that somewhere I feel appreciated, I feel recognized, I feel understood, so that somewhere somebody, even if it is my son, sees me take a stand for myself through him, through fulfilling his aspirations, sees me as a woman of substance, who does voice her opinions, who does take a stand for herself through her son, because invariably she could not do it for herself. And through this movie we'll realize that it is a woman, that it is an individual, a person who lacks confidence, who lacks self-esteem, or who has pretty low self-esteem and low self-worth and low self-trust in herself. We'll also see a similar thing being played out in the movie Dangal, wherein Amir Khan is trying to live his life, his unfulfilled life, his unfulfilled aspirations and ambitions and dreams and desires through his girls, wherein he becomes relentless with them, wherein he to a large degree does not even allow them to do some girly things that they'd want to do for themselves, and in a way, to some degree, transforms them into boys, for they dress up like boys, for they walk like boys, for they talk like boys, at least the socially conditioned way, to a large degree. And maybe that does happen because at least at that point in time, the sports that they were playing, wrestling, was essentially a male-dominated sport, was essentially a gender-biased sport. And thereby, quite naturally, to play that sport, they had to mold themselves in keeping with a more acceptable gender norm, which would work in keeping with that sport, wrestling. Now, that's not to say that it did not create superstars and legends and world-famous athletes and performers like Andre Agassi, like Michael Jackson, the biggest performer of all time, the legendary performer of all times. But it also came with a heavy cost. A cost where people had no friends. A cost where they had no life apart from their parents' aspirations. A cost wherein their dreams were probably never even looked into. And thereby, the kids were not looked into as to what they wanted for themselves. They probably felt ignored and unseen and neglected as people, as individuals themselves. It came at a huge cost of wanting to avoid and escape punishments and of wanting to earn love, rather working to earn love. It came at a huge cost of probably their self-esteem, their self-worth, their self-confidence and their self-trust in themselves, to some degree at least. It came at a huge cost of having to live and deal with something called as CPTSD, complex post-traumatic stress disorder. Which probably stayed with them for a very, very, very large part of their lives. It came at a huge cost of having to be perfect, of needing to be perfect, because anything that was imperfect, that is imperfect, was unacceptable. And thereby their idea of themselves, if they were not perfect, was and is unacceptable. And maybe we need to reflect on all of these aspects. To be able to understand, to be able to reflect on all of these aspects. First, if we are vicariously trying to live our lives through somebody else, and what are we trying to avoid and escape when we are vicariously trying to do it? What opportunities are we not willing to take up when we are vicariously trying to do it? Second, we need to reflect on our self-esteem, our self-worth, our self-confidence. Because quite naturally, if you're trying to do it through somebody else, all of these aspects of ourselves have taken a huge beating. And we are trying to bring it up by doing it through somebody else. And unfortunately, the other person will need to keep doing it, will need to keep performing it and proving it for us, for our personal self-esteem, for our personal internal self-worth to be elevated. And many a times unknowingly, we might be dragging them into it without their consent. We might be asking them to carry their own self-esteem and their own self-worth and their own self-related issues along with our baggages, along with ours as well. And in my understanding, that's a lot of baggage, that's a lot of burden to carry. Thirdly, it should also make us reflect if we are truly seeing the person, hearing the person, acknowledging the person in front of us as they are, for who they are, rather than they just being extensions of us who are helping us live our unfulfilled lives, our unrealized expectations of ourselves and maybe of others from us. Are they just extensions of us rather than they being individuals in their own rights who have the right to live their own life, who have the right to make their own choices, who have the right to disagree with us if need be? But not seeing them as that, we are seeing them as the extension of ourselves who will help us live our own unfulfilled aspirations, ambitions, and desires. Who will help us in enhancing, in elevating our self-esteem, our self-worth, our social worth. Who will help us project a perfect image of ourselves and of our family, thereby enhancing our social status. Fourthly, when we are trying to live vicariously through others, and if we are trying to do that knowingly or unknowingly, we need to question if we have taken away somebody's right to freedom, to make their own choices, to live their own lives, to have their own ambitions and aspirations. Fourthly, we also need to reflect if you're vicariously trying to live through somebody else, maybe we've not even considered the person. Maybe we've not even considered their choices. Maybe we've not considered their freedom to make their choices. Maybe we've not considered that they are independent, separate creatures, separate individuals, to have a right to have their own aspirations, to have their own ambitions, to have their own dreams, which may not be mine, which may be very different from me. And maybe we have not considered their consent. And we can only acknowledge somebody's consent when we have acknowledged their existence in the first place. And essentially, when we do not do that, when that's not taken into consideration, we have unknowingly caused an existential trauma, an existential dilemma, an existential crisis. And fifthly, we also need to be able to deal with the anguish, with the pain, with the hurt, with the disappointment of not having lived our own lives, of not having fulfilled our own dreams and our own aspirations. And we need to be able to grieve it and maybe let go of it, or we need to try and fulfill it ourselves rather than making it somebody else's job and duty, rather than making it somebody else's baggage and somebody else's agenda. And I'd also like to know if you can share through your comments, if you can think about a movie or a famous celebrity who as a grown-up child were vicariously trying to live through their parents. Because many a times, or at least in this video, through this video, right from the story of Duryodhan, going back a few thousand years, to the few celebrated names, whether in the name of show business or whether in the name of sports, or through the few movies that I've just shared, what essentially has come up is parents trying to live vicariously through their kids. It's grown-ups trying to live vicariously through their kids in very hard, in over-passionate, in over-aggressive, and in non-consensual ways. So if you can think of any celebrity or any movie which shows a grown-up child living vicariously through the parents, it would throw some more light, a different aspect to be looked into in keeping with this topic. I'd like all of us to look into all of these aspects that I've shared through this video, within this video. And I'd also like to hear your comments with regards to the last bit that I've just asked of you, to help me recollect something that probably was not coming into my mind. Please take the time to reflect and to share. And I'll see you once again the next week. Till then, stay tuned in. And guys, if you do like the contextual content of these videos, please do like, share, and subscribe.